Hi, welcome back to the Flaming Brain of Bites. Now, this is another one of these rather difficult episodes for me because it requires that I really open up and share some, personal things. But it's important because I'm weird and I know it, and I want to try and explain perhaps some of the reasons why. So I hope you can please indulge me. Now, before I begin this, I want to apologize that this is a little bit lengthy at about 33 minutes. However, to try and relay these stories in any less time, I'd be doing great injustice because I could easily make this 3 times as long if I wanted to go into all the details. So I hope you can bear with me on this because it is like these are the things that have molded and shaped me and made me the weirdo that I am. So I started out pretty normal, like most kids. Um, I had great parents, um, but when I started the first grade in 1962, nobody knows shit about ADHD, dyslexia, or especially bipolar disorder. And since I suffered from all three of these things, um, it made education extremely difficult. I had a very, very hard time trying to learn things the normal way. So when it was about a week away from starting the third grade, I got some devastating news from my parents that because my second grade teacher, Mrs. Detrick, and the principal, Mr. Riley, had pressured my parents to hold me back a year, they finally caved, even though they didn't want to, and I was told I would be repeating the second grade. Well, this was very devastating news, obviously. And on the first day of my second time in the second grade, the teacher had everyone stand up one by one to say their name, and she organized the classroom so I would be the last. And as I stood up before I could say my name, the teacher, Mrs. Detrick, said, "And this is Brian. He'll be here with us again this year." And at this point, there were giggles in the classroom, and I could hear a couple kids say flunky. And the teacher even had to say, "Now, class, calm down." Well, I sank down into my chair, absolutely humiliated. First time of many in the future, I would feel so humiliated. And as you might imagine, none of the kids wanted to befriend a flunky. And so I spent the whole second time in the second grade with a whole new group of kids, not making any friends, spending all my time alone. Um, and that continued into the third grade, and things didn't begin to change until I was in the fourth grade. But by then, the die was cast. I had already become accustomed to being alone and lonely, and it kind of continued all the way through uh, my school years. I had very few friends in high school, and I'm sad to say most of those friendships began like in my late sophomore or freshman year, whatever comes before junior. Um, and they were mostly drug related friends because we all smoked a lot of weed. So after high school, I really didn't have any friends to say. So that kind of set the pace for me living a rather lonely life. Now, if there's one thing I've always found quite amazing is the fact that some people can breeze through life without ever having to deal with anything tragic or really monumental, and other people, such as myself, seem to be a lightning rod. And I call this the Roy Sullivan effect. And who is Roy Sullivan? Well, he was a park ranger in Shenandoah Park in Virginia who had the record of being struck by lightning more than any other person, a total of 7 times in his life. And the chances of one person being struck 7 times by lightning is 1 in 10 octillion. And if you look here at Mr. Sullivan, you can see the burn mark on his hat where he once got hit. And sadly, after the seventh time, this guy ended up committing suicide. Now, my first experience with a truly tragic event happened in the summer of '75. It was a hot day, and I was out at one of my favorite places, Clackamas Park on the Clackamas River in Oregon. And I was about mid-chest level deep in the water with my back facing upstream when suddenly something bumped into me. And when I turned to my right to see what it was a body that slipped off to my left and continued downstream by the current. And I yelled to the people downstream from me and said, "Body, body." And they managed to grab hold and pull this guy out of the water. And he had just drowned upstream. And oh, it was horrible watching them drag this poor guy out of the water. A truly horrible experience. And I entered Oregon Institute of Technology in Klamath Falls in the fall term of 1976, even though I didn't think I would be successful in college because my primary education had been so poor. I mean, I graduated high school with a C minus, but to appease my father, I decided to go into an engineering program, mechanical engineering, and give it my best shot. And it was about November when I met a young lady, Carlene, who worked at a pizza parlor, and she really seemed to like me. And so I tried to make it in there as often as I could. Typically, I tried going every Friday night when she worked. And we were seemingly really beginning to hit it off. Now, personally, I think it was because she really dug my white man's afro. But anyway, by about the around the middle of the winter term, I realized that college just wasn't working for me. I couldn't focus. I couldn't learn anything because I had never learned proper studying skills in my primary education. So I decided I wanted to drop out and pursue my passion at the time, which was putting on laser light shows. I loved doing laser light shows, and I wanted to make that a career because I used to do laser light shows at parties in the dorm and at certain off-campus apartments and homes on weekends, and it was quite popular. So I decided to quit college, and I was going to come home to Portland and perfect my gear and go back. And I had reserved an auditorium for the early part of May to put on my first show. And by this point, I really started to develop a real strong friendship with Carlene. And so the whole time I was home working on the light show, I would write her typically once a week, because in those days calling on the phone was too expensive with long distance charges. So I'd write her every 7 to 10 days, and she'd write me back. And the main thing I was trying to do at the time was all I had was a red laser. It was a spectrophysics helium neon laser that produced a very weak red beam, pretty much like this one here. But I wanted to add some color. I wanted to have some blue and some green to really spice up the show. So I set about to build an argon ion laser, which was no easy task. It was very complex. Here you can see a production version, and it produced a beautiful blue-green beam of light. So when I was preparing to go back down to Klamath Falls to put on my light show, the day before I was going to go down there, I tried calling Carlene, but she didn't answer her phone. And then the day I was leaving, I called again, and she didn't answer her phone, which didn't really concern me too much. However, once I got down there, she still wasn't answering, and I went by. So I went to the pizza parlor where she worked, and it's then that they told me that the week earlier she had gone down to California to visit her parents, and one night she was out walking across a crosswalk, and a hit-and-run driver struck her and killed her. And I was so shaken up by this turn of events. I just couldn't proceed with my laser light show, so I had to go and put a. Fortunately, this happened I was there Friday when I found this out. My show was scheduled for Saturday evening, so I went and I put a note on the door saying, I'm sorry, I had to cancel my show. And I went by the local radio station, and I couldn't afford to pay for an announcement. But when I explained the circumstances, they agreed to run kind of a little PSA a couple times to say that anybody who was planning to go to the Parallax Lazite, that's what I called my show had been canceled. And I packed up my gear and I turned around and I made the 5-hour drive home. And when I got home, I was very, very despondent. In fact, I think this was like the first time I actually seriously considered ending myself. And from that point on, my plans to pursue a laser light show career pretty much came to an end. Now, fast forward about 2 years, year and a half or so, from October of 1980 until March of 1981, there was a really bad guy committing rape, robbery, and murder along the I-5 corridor between northern Washington and northern California. And he was given the name the I-5 Bandit, or later he was called the I-5 Killer. So now, fast forward to March of 81, and I asked my brand new hairdresser on a date, and we decided to go see Harry Chapin in concert on March 13th. Now, Harry Chapin was one of my favorite artists at the time. He was a folk singer and had some really great songs, such as Taxi and Cats in the Cradle, like this.
It was raining hard in Frisco. I needed one more fare to make my night.
And the concert was great. It was really fun to see him. But then, tragically, just 4 months later, Mr. Chapin was killed in a tragic highway accident back on the East Coast. And it was a very sad day because he was really quite an amazing person and humanitarian, a really good guy. Anyway, we went back to her apartment and we sat on her sofa, turned on the TV. It was almost 11 o'clock when I tried to make my move. I put my arm around her, but was still on the sofa. And then the news came on. And the big news at the moment was the fact that police had caught the infamous I-5 killer. Now, the whole Pacific Northwest had been on pins and needles for 6 months, wondering when this guy was going to strike next. And this was the news conference that came on. And I kind of turned my attention away and just as I touched her left shoulder, she bolted upright and fainted right onto the floor, which freaked me out because this picture had come on the TV, and they said his name, Randall Woodfield. And I had no idea why she had fainted. I was just totally freaked out. I thought she died when I touched her. But I got her back up on the sofa. I brought her around. She looked back at the TV and fainted again and then fainted again. And finally, she was able to tell me that on the day I asked her out, that night, she broke up with him on the phone. And this was just unbelievably shocking to find this out. I mean, the very notion that she had been dating this guy the whole time that he was doing his deeds was almost more than I could take. And it was just horrible. But then she said something that just put a chill down my spine. She told me that on the day I asked her out, when she was breaking up with him on the phone that night. He was very insistent about wanting to come and see her, and she kept saying, no, no, no. But after she hung up the phone, she got a weird feeling and decided to go and stay at a friend's house for the night. And when she came home the next day, someone had broken in, but nothing was missing. Now, this guy, it was later found out, had killed one of his other girlfriends in her apartment. So it's undoubtful that if she had stayed home that night, he would have killed her. And then, with no suspects to go by, they would have done their investigation. They would have gone to her salon, and they would have found out that on the day she died, earlier that day, me, a new customer, or new client, had got her number and address, her phone number and address. And that would have probably made me person of interest number one. And if I didn't have a good alibi from that night, I mean, who knows? I could still be sitting in prison for a murder I never committed. And that just freaked me out. And then she told me something that made me realize I probably wouldn't be dating her again. She said, I don't know what's wrong with me. One of my other boyfriend's body, one moment she said body, it kind of, what? She goes, one of my other boyfriend's body was found in an industrial trash container behind Alpenrose Dairy because he was a cocaine dealer. So when I left, I was pretty shaken up, obviously, and I felt really bad for her, but I just couldn't deal with it. And in fact, as soon as I left her place, I began having my first bona fide panic attack when I realized how close I had come to maybe being pegged for a murder I never committed if she had stayed home that night. And I started to really wig out. And fortunately, between her apartment in Beaverton and my apartment in Portland was St. Vincent's Hospital. So as I was passing by, I decided to pull in. I went to the emergency room. I went up to the admissions desk. And when I told them what had happened, the two women sitting there's mouths dropped open and said they had just heard on the news that they caught him. And they couldn't believe my story that I had been dating, or I was on my first date with this woman. And suddenly now everybody came around and wanted to hear my story, but I was too shaken up and too panicky to try and relay the story again. And so fortunately they took pity on me, they admitted me, they gave me a sedative, which really calmed me down. And then I was able to tell the story over again in detail because everybody wanted details. And then next day, of course, I went to work and I had to repeat the story again and again and again. And it was really a very bizarre, weird situation to have happen, as you might imagine. Mr. Woodfield is still in prison, I believe, on 2 life sentences, but they believe he may have been responsible for the murder of up to 44 women. Um, Unbelievable, just unbelievable. But wait, there's more. Um, in 2013, I was dating a woman briefly, and I told her this story. And when I did, her reaction was, and she told me that her college roommate was one of his victims. In fact, I think it was the victim he had killed in her apartment that I referenced earlier, which is like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I mean, talk about 6 degrees of separation. This was more like 2 degrees of separation. Who could possibly imagine something like that could happen? It was just unbelievable the way this story just kind of kept going on. Yeah. Weird, 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 weird. Now let's fast forward to 1987. No, 1988. I had just come back from Turtle Island building my submarine. And I had moved to Southern California, and I was working for a company called Malibu Grand Prix. And they operated in a series of little amusement centers around the country that were miniature racetracks that had scaled down versions of Formula One race cars. And these were not your garden variety go-karts. These were high performance vehicles that could reach 40 miles an hour. And they operated on a closed loop track. You weren't racing each other, you were racing against the clock. And so I went to work for them in March of 1988. Now, the company was located in Woodland Hills, California, and this was the North Ridge track that was the closest one, and it was a track I was most accustomed to. Now, shortly after I moved there, I was in a Mexican restaurant one night at the bar, and in walked a woman and sat down next to me named Cynthia, very pretty girl, a couple years younger than me. I was 32, I think she was 28. and we really seemed to hit it off. So I asked her out for the next Friday, and we went to the Northridge Malibu track, which she really loved. We had a great time. And then I made plans to see her the following week. So the next Friday came, and I picked her up at her apartment, and we were going to go to the Cheesecake Factory. And we had just left her apartment, and I had to stop to get some gas. And when I got back in the car, she was slumped up against the passenger door, and I reached over and shook her, but she didn't respond, and so I got really freaked out and concerned. So I headed to the nearest hospital, and I got there. It had probably been 7, 8, 9 minutes since she had become unconscious. And we got there, and I ran to the hospital. And I said, "Help, help!" And they came out with a gurney, and they got her. And she had died. And of course, I was pretty freaked out by this. And then the police showed up, and when one cop was asking me some questions, the other cop was going through her purse, I guess, to try and find like a phone book or an address book or something to call her parents, which he did. And I'll tell you what, if you think that having someone die in your car is the worst thing you can experience, it's like, no. If that was like getting a paper cut on your finger, what was about to come next would be like having your whole finger just ripped off your hand. Because when her parents arrived, oh my goodness, they were just what you might expect. They were in agony, wailing in grief at the loss of their daughter. And I was standing there, and of course they were looking at me with a great deal of suspicion because they had only heard her mention my name one time, didn't know anything about me. All they knew is I picked her up and she was dead now. And at one point, the father had his hands on my shoulders and he was going, "What did you do? What did you do to my little girl?" And I was just standing there. I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything. And it was a horrible situation. And so anyway, I went home and I basically stayed in my room for the next 3 days, didn't come out, didn't go to work. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I was so beside myself because the very thought that there were people looking at me thinking I may have done something, maybe I'd given her a drug or anything, was more than I could bear. And I was very close to being suicidal at that point until finally the dad called and said that the autopsy showed that she had had a massive cerebral hemorrhage and had literally just died instantly. And like I said, that it was a ticking time bomb in her head, and it just happened to go off when it did. And he was very apologetic for thinking that I may have had something to do with it. And yeah, it was awful. And so they really wanted me to come to the memorial service, and I kind of didn't want to go, but I agreed to, and I'm glad I did because when I got there, the parents were telling me that they were really glad that it happened the way it did because if I had shown up just 10 minutes later than I did, she wouldn't have answered her door, and she may have laid in there for several days before anyone discovered that she had died. But since it happened with me there, um, that didn't happen, and they found out. And once again, they were so conciliatory about having believed that I might have had something to do with it that I am glad that I went. And yeah, it was a really, what can I say? I didn't even ask another woman out at this point for 6 years. And then in 1998 came Kimberly Kay. She was a flight attendant for Alaska Airlines who had just moved from Seattle to Vancouver, Washington, and used to fly either Portland to LA to Puerto Vallarta, or she'd take a commuter flight to Seattle and go Seattle to LA to Puerto Vallarta. And I met her at my friend's annual I Hate Winter party that they had every February because they had met her on a flight, and then when they heard she was new to the area, they invited her to the party, and we hit it off and really liked each other. And since she could fly for free on Horizon Airlines, which is owned by Alaska, she agreed to come over to Bend the following weekend to visit. And of course, I had a bedroom for her. But about 1 a.m., she came up to my room and asked me if I could please take her to a phone booth so she could make a call. And I'm saying, like, well, no, you can call from here. But she was really insistent that she needed to go to a phone booth. Well, I sat her down and started talking with her. And then I kind of got to the bottom of things. And what I learned was that there was a guy she had met on one of her flights, a married guy that she had become involved with. And she didn't want to be involved with him anymore now that she had met me. And she wanted to break up with him. But she didn't want to call from my place because she didn't want him to see the caller ID number and know that she was at my place. But I talked with her and convinced her that she could wait until she got home and call. She didn't have to do it from my place. But this gave me a lot of reason to go very, very slowly. We never had relations. And over the next 8 weeks, we saw each other 4 different times. Twice she came over to Bend. Twice I drove over to Portland. And then came my trip to China. And I was supposed to leave at 4:30 the following morning to go to the airport. So about 8 o'clock at night, I was in the process of packing up. And she called, and she was in really bad shape. I mean, she was saying some really strange and odd things. And I knew at this point that when I came back, I was going to have to break up with her because she was just too damaged, and I knew I couldn't fix her. And at the end of the phone conversation, I thought she had just hung up. So I left and went back to packing and left for China the next day. And a week later, I was coming home from China. I was on an LA to Portland flight on Alaska. And on the flight, I just casually asked the flight attendant, "Do you know Kimberly Curie?" She goes, "Yeah, how do you know her?" And I said, "Well, we've been dating for about 2 months." And then the woman looked at me and she said, "Well, where have you been?" I said, "I've been in China for a week." And then this woman just turned white as a ghost and goes, "Don't you know what happened?" And I go, "No." She goes, "She died last Tuesday." And that was the night she called me. And I'm like, you must be thinking of someone else." She shook her head. And then she said, "Is your name Brian?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And they said they found her in her chair with the phone on her lap, the receiver off the hook. And when the police checked, they found out that mine was the last number that she had called. And they wanted to talk to me, see if I could enlighten them. And of course, I went into total shock at this point. I mean, I was so busy getting ready for my trip that I really couldn't hear the desperation and the pain in her voice of what she was going through. But now I was beginning to replay it in my head, going, "Oh my God, why didn't I see this? Why didn't I know what was going on?" I mean, it was obviously too late because she had taken a handful of pills, and instead of hanging up, she had just faded away. So when I got to Portland, I went to my folks, and I was just freaked out. And the next morning, I found out that there was in the paper, it was an obituary, and that day, Saturday, there was a memorial service up at the, I think it was the University of Washington campus up in the Seattle area at the chapel. So I decided rather than to fly straight back to Bend, I changed my flight. I went to Seattle to go to her memorial. And I walked in, I went to the back of the chapel, and I began to cry. And one by one, her fellow flight attendants were standing up front telling their favorite Kimberly stories. And sadly, I was really the only person in that room who truly knew what was going on in her life, the pain she was suffering, because she told me that she had gotten involved with too many men and had kind of spread herself thin and had too many of these non-boyfriend types that had really kind of diluted her soul, I guess. And no one there knew me. I knew no one there. And I could not stop crying. And people kept looking back at me going, who is this guy? Why is he blubbering? And the truth of the matter is, I couldn't stop crying until I got back to Bend. And I was obviously shaken up for quite some time, and I thought that was the end of the story, but it wasn't, because about a year later, January 31st, 2000, an Alaska flight bound from Puerto Vallarta to LA to Seattle crashed on approach to LAX. This was the flight 261 where the screw jack broke and the elevator was stuck in a position. And the pilot came on and said, folks, we're going to crash in about 5 minutes. We're going to hit the ocean. We're all going to die. There's nothing we can do about it. And that's what happened. Everyone died on board. And quite frankly, when I think about it, there was probably a good 80% chance that she would have been on that flight. And I'm actually happy she went the way she did, rather than spending the last 5 minutes of her life in an airplane with 100 some odd people just in fear and panic and crying and screaming because they all knew they were going to die. So as you can see, I've had this like unending series of horrible traumatic events. And in every case, I had no one to talk to, no one to counsel with, no therapy. I just had to suck everything up and move on with life. But it has tainted me and has caused me a lot of problems. And like I said, I don't know why certain things happen to certain people, but they do. And just like Roy Sullivan, um, the lightning has struck me more times than I care to admit. And quite truthfully, these are just some of the more dramatic experiences I've had. There have been many other strange things that have happened that defy my ability to understand. Um, so this is one of the reasons I am a little bit weird, maybe a lot bit weird. Um, yeah, that's the deal.